This set of PowerPoints is going to look at the theories of child development. This is part of Chapter 2. There are 3 sets of PowerPoints for Chapter 2. In this set of PowerPoints, we're going to be talking about a field that's called the psychoanalytic, or known as the psychodynamic school of thought. Understand that there's a lot of many different theories out there. In fact, there's probably hundreds. And whether or not theories stand the test of time depends upon whether or not researchers find that they are applicable to the field and that they're helpful for not only research but also for practice. In this course, we're only going to be covering a few of what are considered to be the grand theories. These are theories that laid the foundation for the field for which other theorists came along and jumped off of or borrowed from or diverged completely away from. Understand too that this is just a brief overview, that you're not going to become experts in any of these theories, and in order to become an expert, you really need to read original works. So what are theories? Theories are not proven fact. They are a product of a person's life's work. They guide a profession. They're used and encouraged in research. They help us to understand others and the world. And once again, in order to really understand a theory, you need to read original work. This first perspective is going to be the psychoanalytic perspective. Once again, remember that there's a lot of variation in this field, but that we're only going to be talking about Freud's theory and Erikson's theory. Freud laid the foundation for the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic field, and Erikson came along shortly afterwards and was trained under Freud but diverged away from Freud. Throughout this course, we'll be revisiting Erikson's theory because I feel that it transfers cross-culturally very nicely. You can take it as a template and put it over a culture to understand the development, the values, and the structure of that culture as it relates to child development. Most people have heard of Sigmund Freud. He was born in 1856 and he died in 1939. He's responsible for the field of psychoanalysis, and he brought awareness to levels of the unconscious, stages of development, and parts of personality. He was a medical doctor, but he was much more interested in the mind. And at one point in his career, he went to Paris and studied with a man by the name of Jean Charcot, who was working with hypnosis. And so Freud learned more about the unconscious, went back to Vienna, where he set up his practice and worked for most of his life until he moved to London. Freud believed that our awareness, our consciousness, is really the tip of an iceberg, and that really under the water level is a whole body of experiences that happen to us maybe when we were younger that impact our development in our life as an adult. And even though we don't see them, they still very much are present and impact us. So if a person is struggling in life, according to Freud, what would be important to do would be to bring the unconscious material to the surface where it can be processed and help a person grow and change. And this is through the process of psychoanalysis. This is a form of therapy that he created. Freud created 5 what he referred to as psychosexual stages of development. And he felt that if you didn't get your needs met at these particular levels of development, that they would impact your life as an adult. And if something happened and if it was threatening to your psyche, to your ego, that we would push it down into our unconscious. And even though we, again, maybe weren't aware of it, it still impacts us as an adult. Of these stages, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but the oral stage is around birth to 1 year of age. And if you don't get your needs met at that time, you could develop an adult oral personality. This means maybe that you would smoke, you would overeat, you would be very talkative. There's really no evidence of oral personality, but Freud was a good observer of children and realized that getting needs met at that particular very vulnerable stage is important. The anal stage is from 1 to 3 years of age, and if you know children who are around 1 to 3 years of age. They're beginning to walk. They're beginning to do more things. They're getting toilet trained. They're wanting to assert themselves in certain kinds of ways. And if you get stuck at that stage, according to Freud, you would develop an anal personality where you would be very maybe stingy with your money. You'd be very overly clean, overly uptight about orderliness. Once again, there's really no evidence of the anal personality, though people have gotten a lot of mileage out of some of those aspects of that stage of development. The phallic stage is around 3 to 6 years of age, and when you think about children that you know that are 3 to 6, they're really beginning to try and figure out who are they as a person and how does the world really fit together. This is the stage where Freud came up with a very fancy way of understanding and communicating how girls turn out to be girls and boys turn out to be boys, and this is the area where the Oedipus complex is discussed in Freud's theory. And this is where the little boy has a fantasy, for instance, of marrying his mother, and he realizes that in order to do that, he's going to have to get dad out of the picture, and he realizes that that's not a very good thing to do, so that in order to handle this dilemma is that he represses his desire to marry his mother and grows up in the image of his father. In the next slide, we're going to be talking specifically about the stages of personality development. Latency is the next stage, which is around 7 to 11 years of age. And this is a time when this sexual energy that Freud felt that propels us through our development, and even that infants have this energy, is that during the latency era, it goes fairly dormant. Girls play with girls, boys play with boys, and according to Freud, it reemerges during the genital stage, which is around 12 plus years of age, and propels us into adult relationships. Freud focused a lot on pathology, and he did feel that if a person, again, is having difficulty with living, is that they probably got stuck at one of these stages of development. How the personality develops is that a child is born with what he referred to as the id. It's the self-serving, present at birth, and unconscious. When a baby is needing something, the baby doesn't lie in its crib and think, well, I'm going to give my parents some time to adjust. They've had a long day. The baby screams, hold me, change me, feed me now. Eventually, the ego begins to emerge, and this is where the child realizes that, hey, I don't always get my needs met when I want, and I'm not always the center of the universe. And so this reality begins to kind of step in as the child gets to also know themselves. The superego is the part of the personality that is the moral seat of judgment and guides our behavior. And so it appears around 4 years of age or so, around in there, 4 or 5, and is happening around the time of the phallic stage, when children, again, are trying to figure out how the world fits together and their role within that. As mentioned previously, a fixation is where a person can get stuck, and therapy is where you can get unstuck and deal with your unconscious processes that will help you move forward in life. Erik Erikson was also living in Europe. He was born in 1902, and he actually later in his late 20s was trained by Maria Montessori to work with young children, and was then directed to go and work with Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter. Anna Freud was working with the children of the patients of Freud, and Erik Erikson went and worked with her, and they felt that he would make a very good child analyst. So Erik Erikson got trained in the psychoanalytic theory, and eventually, when World War II struck, he moved over to Boston and ended up actually even working in San Francisco after the war with Mount Zion Hospital around war neuroses, which would be PTSD with our veterans, today. And he actually also did some work at UC Berkeley. He ended up on the East Coast and was very influential in setting up his own theory that's known as the psychosocial stages of development. He modified Freud's theory, and his theory is often positioned next to Freud's in a lot of textbooks. A couple of things that are different. His theory was felt to be a little bit more positive than Freud's. It expanded upon stages from 5 to 8. It goes from birth to death, where Freud's ends at adolescence. And also, Erikson includes and was very interested in how one's culture and historic times influences development. So once again, we will be using Erikson's theory kind of throughout this course, because I feel that taking it as a template, it crosses and it works well cross-culturally to examine a culture and to understand the values of that culture and how that contributes to how we raise children in today's society. So this slide also just shows that he extended his stages to 8 stages, and it was much more purposeful and conscious than unconscious. And he also focused a lot on self-identity. Here's a list of Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because we will revisit his stages throughout our textbook. The first is trust versus mistrust, and all of his stages are a dichotomy. And that doesn't mean that a child, for instance, gets trust or learns mistrust, but that is foundational in building upon one's development. And that he felt that there's a virtue that comes out of each stage, and if you don't get what you need during a stage, you can go back and do reparative work at any time. So it's much more positive than Freud's. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is our 1 to 3-year-old. Once again, that budding autonomy, wanting to do more things for oneself, and the shame and doubt that can come if somebody shames a child for having an accident, for instance, while they are getting potty trained. The next is initiative versus guilt. And you think about our 3 to 6-year-olds, that they're wanting to take the initiative, they're wanting to do more things, and it's a pretty exciting time. And that sometimes children, the flip side of not being able to do something that they kind of envision themselves being able to do, according to Erikson, would be feeling guilty. The next is industry versus inferiority. And that's our 7 to 11-year-olds. And when you think about kids of that age, they spend a lot of time in school. Friendships are really important. And kids have a better understanding of themselves, but they're comparing themselves a lot to others and how they fit in. So being able to feel competent is really important during that stage of development. Identity versus role confusion or diffusion is our 12 to 19-year-olds. And this is a lot of the questions about who am I and who am I becoming. So this was something that Erikson himself struggled with. And so if you ever learn a lot about his life, you'll see the threads of his own life in his own theory. Now, this class ends actually in adolescence, but I have listed here the last 3 sections of his theory, and I think it's important to understand them from a continuity standpoint. Intimacy versus isolation has to do with, are you moving towards people or away from people as you are becoming an adult? Generativity versus stagnation. Do you feel like that you have a role in life, or do you feel stagnant? And it doesn't mean that you're working for a job, but just, do you feel like you have a purpose? And then at the end of your life, do you feel like that your life has been worthwhile, that you've been able to learn from mistakes, or do you have a sense of despair? So Erikson's stages, once again, he valued Freud, but he really diverged away, wanted to incorporate culture, historic times, and look more at the positive aspects of one's development. The next presentations will look at behavioral and learning and cognitive theory.